Messieurs, je vous souhaite la bienvenue pour cette conférence de presse sur le Pacte mondial pour des migrations sûres, ordonnées et régulières. On a le plaisir d'accueillir aujourd'hui pour parler de ce thème important et vraiment d'actualité l'ambassadeur Jörg Laubert, que vous connaissez bien pour la plupart d'entre nous, puisqu'il s'occupait notamment des organisations internationales à Berne pendant de longues années, et qui est maintenant notre ambassadeur de Suisse à New York, l'ambassadeur du Mexique, M. Juan José Gómez Camacho, et puis naturellement Madame Louise Arbour, grande connaissance de Genève, puisqu'elle on a eu le plaisir de la voir à Genève pendant de longues années aussi, où elle a exercé un rôle tout à fait important et qui est actuellement représentante spéciale du secrétaire général pour les migrations internationales et en même temps aussi secrétaire général de la conférence intergouvernementale sur les migrations. Madame Arbour, c'est un plaisir de vous retrouver. Alors, je vais vous demander d'abord de signer notre petit livre d'or avant de vous passer la parole. Une petite signature.
Juste ici?
Oui. Je vous remets aussi notre dernière publication qu'on a faite pour les 20 ans du Club de la Presse. New York, ça sera une petite lecture dans l'avion. Puis Madame Arbour retrouvera des choses qu'elle a déjà... Ah, si, on affirme. Voilà. Très bien, je reprends. Merci. Et puis, je passe la parole à M. Laubert. Il faut juste appuyer sur le bouton du micro. La lumière s'allume, c'est bon.
C'est bon. Alors, en tant que local, merci beaucoup, merci Guy de nous avoir ici. Merci à tous et à toutes de votre présence, à votre entrée à ce sujet qui nous amène à Genève. With your permission, although being Swiss and in Geneva, I'd like to speak English because we are so much in the lingo of using this in English. But for the question and answers, of course, very happy to receive questions in French and trying to respond in French. If this is agreeable to you, I would like to be brief, but give you maybe a few points on where we are coming from with this process, what's the starting point, where we have come with our own process so far, and what's the next steps. The starting point, and I hope I'm not saying things you, of course, know for a long time already, but the starting point was last year, the New York Declaration on Refugees and Migrants, where the member states of the UN, after a long time, finally decided to deal with these issues on a global level, especially migration, although being an issue concerning almost all states around the globe, has not been dealt with on a global level by the UN. That took a very long time. And then there was, in this sense, the declaration, I think we can say, was a real breakthrough last year. The member states expressing a willingness to look at the phenomenon of migration in all its aspects. If you look at the declaration, the New York Declaration, it has a long list of specific issues pertaining to migration and the willingness to look at it together. They also decided they wanted to have two compacts, one on refugees and one on migrants, and the one on migrants is the one we are dealing with, that brought us to Geneva again today. The idea or the mandate is to have to take a step further from the declaration, to have a set of commitments and recommendations, measures that are practical, policies practical and implementable, to give real follow-up to the declaration of last year. And that's the mandate the member states gave themselves, and that's the mandate we feel we have as co-facilitators. We designed then a process to come up with this compact that stretches over about 2 years, 3 phases. The first phase we are in now, 6 thematic sessions. The last one is taking place tomorrow and Friday here in Geneva. 3 of them were in Geneva, 2 in New York, 1 in Vienna, around all these issues that were laid down in the New York Declaration. And this phase is really designed to exchange information, data, to make delegations more comfortable with the issue, to exchange national practices, to make the whole discussion in this phase more evidence-based. Because as we all know, migration is an issue that implicates a lot of politics or emotions, but not necessarily always the facts. And that was really the idea of this first phase between early this year and December, to have discussions on what is really going on, what are the real figures behind the issues. We know what is happening on country level and regional level and global level. And so far, I think we are doing well. We had positive spirit, good engagement in these discussions. These 6 thematic consultations are complemented by regional consultations that are organized by the regional organizations of the UN. They're not chaired or organized by us. We are participating in them because the regional perspective is a very important element also to understand the phenomenon of migration in all its aspects. It's essentially an intergovernmental process, so member states decided they want this compact, member states decided to be the drivers. Our mandate is from the member states. But as we said from the beginning as co-facilitators, we want the process to be inclusive and transparent. That's also part of the mandate as we felt it. Member states wanted that as well. So there's possibilities always for other what we call stakeholders to participate in these meetings. We have separate meetings for civil society. We are meeting with representatives of the business community and other organizations that are involved on migration issues. So the first phase is for us slowly coming to an end. The next phase will be what we call a stock-taking phase, essentially a conference organized by our Mexican friends, and the ambassador will tell you a bit more about that. The idea is really to have a moment where all of the discussions and the findings we had in this first phase is coming together, and a last chance again to familiarize everybody with the issues, to again having a fact-based discussion really, and at the same time a preparation for the last phase, the actual negotiation phase. The negotiation phase will be first half year of 2018, based on a zero draft for this compact that will be written by the co-facilitators with help, of course, of others. One very important element will be the report by the special representative and her team, laying out the issue from her perspective of migration, and that will be then this last phase, as I said, leading up to an intergovernmental conference, which we are not quite sure yet where and when it will take place, but it should take place around September. New York is one possibility for the place where that conference could take place. That just in a few words where this whole process is coming from and where it's going. We are really happy to have this opportunity to talk to you today, because we feel it's one of the processes that people should know about. It's, you know, there's so much reporting and talk and discussion about human mobility, refugees, migrants. Now the UN is actually, UN and the member states are addressing it, are talking about it, and it's very important, in our opinion, that a wider audience, a wider public also knows that this discussion is going on, in order to be able to participate also in discussion, because so many people around the world are in one way or another concerned by the phenomenon of migration. One of the things I learned in this first phase, what I found very interesting, is that there is almost no country on the planet left that is not touched by migration. Mm-hmm. And more interestingly, no country that is touched in only one way, like only as a country of destination, or only as a country of origin, or only as a country of transit. Almost everybody is everything now. Almost every country sees people leaving, sees people arriving, and sees people passing through. And that's a very interesting phenomenon, something I wasn't so aware of. Could have been if I had thought about it more properly. Yeah. But that's one of the things I really learned in this first few months of our discussion. So it's as a short introduction from my side, and I'm sure my co-facilitator has some points to complement.
Thank you to you all for being here, and I of course agree entirely with Ambassador Lauber's points. I will just make 2 or 3 more as co-facilitator of the process with him. One of the big news around this process is that it's happening. Migration is a global phenomenon. We are talking about more or less 240 million people around the world. Migration is transnational in nature for obvious reasons, and therefore it can't be addressed solely at the national level. And this is what member states or countries around the world within the United Nations agreed. We need to address it collectively. It has to be addressed through cooperation, and we need global understandings. Second, because of this, the Global Compact's challenge and purpose, more than challenge, its purpose, is to make migration, as its title says, safe, orderly, and regular, which is an enormous endeavor. And in order to achieve that, to make migration safe, orderly, and regular, these 240 million people around the world, is that through this process that Ambassador Lauber just described it to you, we are building the Global Compact that will contain these necessary understandings for that to happen. Third, migration, something we are realizing and understanding during this process, is that these 240 million people around the world, and it's totally true what Ambassador said, which is everywhere in the world there's migration, represent 3.5% of the global population. But what is more interesting is that this 3.5% of the global population contributes with close to 9% of the global GDP. Migrants around the world are producing, more or less, according to different figures coming from different sources, 6.57 trillion US dollars every year. In other words, migration has an enormous global economic impact, and migration has or is an enormous contributor to global sustainable development. And this is one of the most critical things to understand for the Global Compact to be successful in making migration safe, orderly, and regular. Second phase of this process, we are in the first one. Second phase is Mexico, is Puerto Vallarta. We are calling that session the stock-taking session. It will take place between the 4th and 6th of December of this year. And the purpose of that session is to do that, to take stock of all these months of discussions globally. In the phase where we are not only discussing and debating and understanding and learning migration in this 360 degrees approach, not only at the global level, as we are doing it here in Geneva and as we do in New York, but also at the regional level, sub-regional level, and in many cases bilateral or binational levels. So the purpose of Mexico, the meeting in Mexico, is to put all that together, to understand and to filter through everything we have discussed and learned, to make it coherent, and to put a final, more objective picture of the global migration phenomenon. As Ambassador Lauber said, we lack enough data, we lack enough evidence, we lack enough figures. But this process is encouraging and boosting the process to get them. And this is what we are getting these months. In Mexico, we will put all that together. And based on this discussion, 3 days discussion in Mexico, in Puerto Vallarta, is where we are going to write the zero draft of what is going to be the global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration that we are going to put in front of member states, and based on it, we are going to negotiate the compact that we expect to finish or to finalize by the end of the year. So far, it's been extremely positive to see the approach that countries and governments are taking to the process. Not only they agreed, or our governments agreed to do it, which in itself is a remarkable decision, but also the commitment, the political commitment that all these governments are showing in the process, their very constructive approach, their openness, in our view, guarantees that we are going to have a very successful process, and we are going to end up with a strong, clear, action-oriented, pragmatic global compact for safe, orderly, and regular migration. I'll leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So Mrs. Albert, please.
Yes, thank you very much. The co-facilitators have described to you this process. Maybe the contribution I could make is to give you examples of how profoundly transformative this process actually has been already and will be, I think, when the Global Compact on Migration is finally negotiated. And when I say it's profoundly transformative, the mere fact that it's taking place is in itself a remarkable evolution in the work of the United Nations and in the mindset of its member states. Until maybe even 10 years ago, it was very difficult to have conversations in the United Nations setup on human mobility. As you know, states have, to various degree, an appetite for dealing with the cross-border circulation of goods, the cross-border circulation of capital, but I think it's fair to say that historically they had very little interest in dealing seriously with the cross-border mobility of people. And if anything, the perception was very well anchored that migration was solely a matter of state sovereignty. To some extent, this hasn't changed. We reiterate in each one of these consultations the fundamental principle that every state has the sovereign prerogative to control its border and to decide who enters its countries, for what purpose, and for how long. But now I think we've moved into a recognition that this principle of sovereignty, when it comes to human mobility, is also entirely dependent on interstate cooperation. That the minute we say every person has the right to enter and to leave his or her own country, that implies immediately an interaction with, at the very least, a neighboring state. And there's no point telling you, in the modern world of the ease of communications and transportation, technologies have made human mobility increasingly easier than it was in the past. And the actual management infrastructure has not followed pace. This is what this global compact, I think, is all about. So the New York Declaration a year ago, which launched this process, this 2-year process, which at the end will produce the Global Compact on Migration. In fact, if you look at the substance of that document, there are several things that are actually enormously encouraging. The first one is the recognition that migration is an overwhelmingly positive phenomenon. This is an important recognition which I think will now need to be matched by the same perception in public opinion, which is not necessarily the case across the world. This is one of the areas where increasingly we see a disconnect between perception and reality. The good news, in a sense, is that the reality is considerably better than the perception. The less good news is that public policy nowadays is often made more on the basis of perception than reality, but this process, I think, is going to make a huge contribution in moving public perception of migration much, much closer to reality. Ambassador Gomez Gamacho has already made some references to the economic reality of the positive aspect of migration. I'll give you another example. Maybe a decade ago, when people were looking at the economic contribution of migrants, there was always, or often, a very negative statement that migrants earned money in a country of destination, in their host country, but sent it home, as though this was a negative phenomenon. Today, the perception is completely reversed and is much closer to reality. Migrants spend between 80 and 85% of their income in the host community, in the country in which they work and reside. The 15% that they send home to their countries of origin amount to 3 times the size of official development aid. That is, money that governments send as part of their development agenda, monies that come from the taxes paid by taxpayers in their countries, sent back home. The monies that migrants send back home, in a sense, could be described as poor people helping directly poor people. It's their own money that they've earned that they send home. And as I said, this amounts to 3 times the size of official development aid. So from a development point of view, it's an enormously positive contribution which outweighs official development aid and private sector investment. And it's not fickle. It doesn't run away. It's constant, permanent, and extremely helpful. This is recognized in the Sustainable Development Goals, where, and I think it's important to notice that, as you know, there's huge political buy-in in the UN system for the Sustainable Development Goal, the Agenda 2030. Migration is explicitly identified as a goal under what is called SDG 10. Now, SDG 10 is expressed as the goal to reduce inequalities between and within countries. And this is where migration is situated in the thinking of the member states of the UN. So this global compact is designed not to curtail migration, but to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration. What are the current challenges? The first one is obvious, and I think it's the one that propelled the New York Declaration. And it was, to be very frank, a crisis that was very Eurocentric. That is, the crisis provoked by large, sudden flows of mixed migrants. That is, refugees, asylum seekers who ultimately will be successful as refugees, and a host of variety of people on the move for a whole variety of reasons that are often called economic migrants, which I warn is an extreme generalization, which is not true to the complexity of motivations that make people search to make a living in a different country. It ranges from people who genuinely are merely seeking to improve their economic position, to people who are fleeing the slow onset of climate change, desertification, where they can no longer have a long-term prospect of making a living in their own country. There's a spectrum of motivations under this big label, economic migrants. Many of these people become irregular migrants, sometimes called, most unfortunately, illegal migrants. And I pause here to mention that the terminology is rarely innocent. This pejorative description of people who may enter a country or find themselves in a country having entered lawfully in an unregular situation should not be assimilated to criminals, or which the expression illegal migrant often suggests. Irregular migration, I think, will best be addressed by opening more legal pathways. It is driven by impulses to leave, and we have to be very clear about that, the attraction of the informal economy in many Western countries where these irregular migrants have no trouble finding work, but work in often substandard labor standards in an exploitive situation. All these issues will be, I hope, will be addressed positively in the Global Compact. The Global Compact is not meant to be a binding document. Member states are not negotiating a new convention, and it will be as enforceable as the level of political buy-in that it will generate. This is a very complex endeavor because migration presents itself very differently in different parts of the world. You have situations, for instance, in some of the Gulf countries where more than 80% of the population is made out of temporary foreign workers. This is one aspect. You have other countries that have built over time a huge population of irregular migrants for whom return to their country of origin is neither feasible nor desirable. And then you have questions of irregular or illegal entry, questions of smuggling, the question of trafficking in migrants. There's a huge series of challenges that will have to be addressed through what ultimately is going to have to be a cooperative framework. We're talking here, this Global Compact will be at its heart an agreement to cooperate to facilitate safe, orderly, and regular migration. So it's as I said, it's a transformative process as it is unfolding, and if it produces and lives up to the expectations that are reflected in the New York Declaration of last year, this will be an amazingly important step forward for the well-being of millions of people, the migrants themselves, but the people they leave behind, these communities that they support with their income, and for the host communities, to which they also make a very important contribution economically and otherwise, culturally, through pluralism and so on. But even just economically, the data that currently exists, a lot of it coming from the World Bank and so on, and OECD, suggests that overall, migrant workers have a higher rate of employment, very often at lower wages, however, than native workers. So we have to change this narrative and recognize the reality of the positive contribution of migrants and of the fact that not only is migration here to stay, but even if in relative numbers it continues to stay around 3% of the world's population, as the world's population is growing, there will be more people on the move, and as demographics show changes in the geographic location of population growth, it's in everybody's interest to be much better equipped than we are today to manage human mobility. Thank you.
Merci. Thank you for these comments. So I open the questions. Gorgi, tu voulais...
Merci beaucoup. C'est pour nous, en tout cas, des pays dits du Sud, c'est une thématique très importante. J'ai écouté Madame la Présidente de Slotar parler de ce thème en vous remerciant, Monsieur l'Ambassadeur, mais j'ai deux questions. Et en voyant le programme, j'étais très enthousiaste et optimiste, en fait. Et j'ai écouté la dernière déclaration de Mme Harbour qui dit que ce que vous allez faire ne sera pas binding, ne sera pas une action qu'on pourra mettre sur la table contre un gouvernement. Finalement, c'est une déclaration d'intention. Et ça me fait un peu dire à quoi bon, en fait, pour parler français. Pourquoi je dis cela? Et parce que j'ai regardé tout à l'heure en revérifiant la Convention internationale sur la protection de tous les droits des migrants et de leurs familles. Mais il n'y a aucun pays occidental qui l'a signé. Aucun. Même le Canada, qui est très ouvert en matière de migration, Mme Harbour ne l'a pas signé. La Suisse ne l'a pas signé. J'ai vérifié si le Mexique l'avait signé. Si vous l'avez signé en mars 1999, en même temps que mon pays, le Sénégal. Mais là, on se dit clairement, comment? Et ça, Guy Mettan, il peut en être témoin. Parce que parfois, moi, je prends les sujets très au sérieux. Je me dis, mais quand est-ce qu'on va sortir du sentimentalisme sur de telles questions et qu'on se mette sur le plan du droit et du respect de la dignité de tout être humain? Je vous remercie.
Écoutez, vous avez, je pense, très bien situé cette problématique. Le pacte mondial sur l'immigration qui va être adopté l'an prochain, je pense que s'il y a un consensus sur quoi que ce soit présentement, c'est qu'on ne négocie pas un instrument contraignant. It's going to be non-binding. Et je suis très heureuse que vous ayez fait de la comparaison avec le truc sur les travailleurs migrants, le traité, comment ça s'appelle, la Convention sur les droits des travailleurs migrants et des membres de leur famille. Je vais vous dire pourquoi. Cette convention sur les travailleurs migrants, c'est un document contraignant, mais il n'est pas ratifié. Alors, ça ne sert à rien de négocier pendant une dizaine d'années, ce qu'on fait très souvent dans le domaine des droits de l'homme, très longtemps, même sur des sujets comme les droits des personnes handicapées, on négocie pendant très, très longtemps. Si finalement on arrive avec un instrument contraignant, par exemple la Cour pénale internationale, la Convention sur les droits des travailleurs migrants, qui n'est à peu près pas ratifié, et donc qui ne lie que les parties qui l'ont ratifié. À côté de ça, si on met sur pied un pacte mondial sur la migration, où il y a un vrai, je vais le dire en anglais, political buy-in, il y a une acceptation profonde. Disons-le franchement, tout le monde y trouve son compte. Et on le disait tantôt, il n'y a plus aujourd'hui des pays qui ne sont que des pays d'origine ou que des pays de destination. Si on peut s'adresser à tout le monde de façon respectueuse et que tout le monde y trouve son compte, y compris par la protection des droits des migrants, mais que les pays qui sont dans une situation d'origine, dans certains cas, d'accueil, de transit, trouvent leur compte dans une meilleure gestion de la mobilité, je pense qu'on a des meilleures chances de ne pas sombrer dans le sentimentalisme et d'avoir des résultats concrets que d'essayer de négocier un instrument contraignant où finalement on accepte tout, mais on ne s'engage à rien. Alors, je pense qu'on a toutes les raisons d'avoir confiance quand on regarde la Déclaration de New York, le processus en cours, qu'il va y avoir un progrès énorme et dans la mesure où ça va être négocié dans cet esprit qui est fondamentalement un esprit de coopération, moi j'ai confiance qu'on ait des meilleures chances d'avoir des résultats que d'espérer en fait des documents qui finalement ne lient personne.
Monsieur Laubert aussi sur la signature de la Suisse et sur cette question.
Moi, je parle davantage. Je préfère parler de notre projet actuel. Et je suis tout à fait d'accord avec Mme Harbour. Ce qu'on veut à la fin, c'est un effet dans la pratique, de la mise en œuvre. C'est ça ce qu'on cherche maintenant. Et il ne faut pas sous-estimer la force d'un tel accord entre les États, même si ce n'est pas juridiquement contraignant. Le mandat, comme je le comprends, que les États membres se sont donnés et puis qui nous ont donné à nous, c'est vraiment d'arriver à un document qui soit, je l'ai déjà dit en introduction, qui sera implementable, comment on dit, pratique, et en prévoyant des mesures qui peuvent être mises en œuvre vraiment, qui ont un effet très concret, très pratique. Et ça, c'est l'effet qu'on cherche. Il ne faut pas sous-estimer ça. À part ça, il y a toute une série de conventions du droit international qui protègent les migrants en tant qu'êtres humains, pas dans leur qualité forcément en tant que migrants. Et à la fois la déclaration est une confirmation de ces standards. Les États se sont exprimés dans le sens oui, on accepte que les migrants aussi ont des droits, pas en tant que migrants, en tant qu'êtres humains, et ça sera encore affirmé, j'en suis convaincu, par le compact.
Monsieur Camacho.
Oui. Dire quelque chose en anglais, si vous me permettez. Je pense beaucoup mieux en anglais. Adding to what they have just said, both Louis Arbour and Ambassador Lauber, exactly what you explained is exactly the reason why we couldn't have tried to have a legally binding instrument. Precisely because the result would have been exactly the same as the Convention on the Rights of Migrant Workers, which is only partially signed, only by, at the time, countries identified by themselves as countries of origin, and not by a single country, so-called at the time, country of destination. Therefore, that instrument, as good as it may be in terms of content, as good as its rules may be in terms of objectives and spirit, they have no impact whatsoever in the real life. It would be a mistake to believe that only the legally binding notion is what makes something work. Sometimes the other approach, which is the real political commitment, is what makes things change. And in this case, as Luis just said, the enforceability, the strength, the power of the Global Compact is going to depend upon its credibility. And it's being owned by member states. And that's the challenge that we have in building this process. And yes, we are very, very optimistic. We see where the discussions are leading us. We see the political commitment of member states during this process, and these we are talking about the 193 member states. We see the growing dynamics of the process. We see the engagement, and this is another important thing, the engagement of other actors, civil society, migrants, diaspora organizations, parliamentarians, ombudsmen, all these other stakeholders are not only making a more democratic, transparent process, but they themselves will become some kind of guarantors that governments, the United Nations, and other actors really work based on the Global Compact.
Thank you. Yes, but
yeah, here, I have it. Thank you. Nice to see you again here in Geneva, Mr. Ambassador and Madame Arbour. I have a question. Gabriela Sotomayor, Mexican journalist for newspaper Reforma. You are swimming against a big wave of populism, nationalism, bigotry. It's now in the world in the speech. So my question is, how do you plan to bring on board countries which are clearly against making migration safe, orderly, and regular? So that's my question.
I think you're right. For a lot of public policy initiatives, it's not particularly helpful to wait for the perfect time. This particular time is, I think it's fair to say, not perfect. And I'm very aware of that. The one thing I could say is this will be a time for real political leadership. Leadership, by definition, suggest that you have to be ahead of the pack. And I expect that, and what we've seen, as I said, in the New York Declaration is already, at a political level, the recognition of a reality that is much better than perception. This momentum has to be kept, and political leaders, opinion makers, policy opinion makers will have to get their voice out there to respond to this hostile, sometimes toxic perception in some sectors of public opinion. Having said that, I certainly in the conversations that I've had since the beginning of my mandate, I am always very positively surprised that a lot of people who have an open mind, and there's still many who are not wedded absolutely to an ideological position from which they will not change regardless of the evidence that is presented to them. But for the very large majority of people who've never heard what I've mentioned to you before, the contribution of migrants to their host communities, to their home communities, it doesn't take that much to reverse this negative perception that is based on nothing, that is based on stereotypes, on exaggerated fears. So I really believe that if this conversation takes place in the world's public opinion, it will contribute to changing the narrative. But at the end of the day, there will have to be opinion makers and political leadership will have to be very seriously engaged in advancing that agenda.
Merci.
Well, I agree entirely with what Louis said, and I agree with your assessment. Yes, these are very complex times in terms of certain public perceptions about migration. We see 2 or 3 key conditions to make this work successfully. First and foremost is truly understanding the phenomenon, trying to develop a credible and objective picture and understanding of the migration phenomenon globally. Because as Mrs. Arbor said, in some parts of the world, it is based on misperceptions and wrong narratives, etc., etc. So first and foremost, we need, and we are very committed to that, working relentlessly on that, is truly developing a fairer picture, or a picture that is fairer to reality. Second, and in doing that, is creating, maintaining and strengthening the trust amongst governments. That governments, regardless of their views or where they are coming from on this issue, feel comfortable in the process, that the process is transparent, is cooperative, and is also fair. Because governments have enormous challenges in addressing issues like this. It is not only a question of being willing or unwilling to address it. It's not only a question of political will or lack of political will, as if we would have a switch to switch it on or switch it off. It's a much more complex thing that has to do with conditions and circumstances, and very often very political. So we need to make sure that we help in the process or through the process to create these conditions for this to happen. And third, we are very optimistic of something important, not only that we will be successful, but that countries, as they did already, in fact, see the benefit in their own interest of making migration safe, orderly, and regular. If you analyze these three words, each of it, or each of them, has enormous content and very important implications. That regarding or regardless where you come from, where you are, what are your views or your own challenges on migration, truly the solution to this phenomenon or the way to address it, wherever you are or wherever you come from, is precisely in making sure that migration becomes that safe, orderly, and regular.
Muchas gracias. Merci, oui, vas-y.
Hello, Marta Hurtado, Spanish News Agency. Could you be please more concrete? You've talked about policies, commitments, things that we can implement, but you haven't mentioned a single one. What do you want to achieve? Concrete, what do you want the countries to agree on? Thank you.
Well, first of all, this will have to be negotiated amongst countries. It's not what I want them to do, it's what they're going to want and agree to do. But I'll give you a series of examples. First of all, if you go to the New York Declaration, there's probably 78 recommendations and commitments. Some, I agree with you, are very general, so it doesn't tell you very much, such as the commitments to respect all human rights of all migrants. But I'll give you other examples that are much, much more concrete, where I think we have some so-called low-hanging fruits. Currently, I've referred to these remittances, right, that are 3 times the amount of official development aid. In some countries, the amount of remittances amount to up to 20% of their GDP. So it's a lot of money. Currently, the cost of transfer of these monies averages about 7.5%. All member states have agreed this is unconscionable. It's way too high. It's money that is sucked out of this transfer process. It should be reduced. It's reflected in the SDGs, in the New York Declaration, to approximately 3% on average should be an acceptable cost. I'm giving you this. There are many, many other examples, initiatives in the labor standard issues for improving decent work, such as better regulating of recruitment agencies, who sometimes charge, again, unconscionable amount, the equivalent of 1 year's pay to support a migrant finding a job in the formal economy of countries of destination. So better international cooperation on the regulation of recruitment fees, of the cost of remittances. There are lots and lots of concrete initiatives where, again, we don't need a binding instrument. We need a commitment by member states. We need the know-how and the enlisting of UN agencies, whether it's ILO or IOM, other agencies who will come in to support this desire to do better on some of these issues. So there are lots and lots of concrete initiatives throughout all the various sectors in which these issues have been raised. If we get the right political buy-in, and I'm very conscious that the transformation of public opinion is going to have to go a long way, first for the political decision makers to agree to something and then to be capable of implementing it. But I just want to add, maybe in reference again to the previous question, that at some point reality will catch up with this ideological type perception. To give you an example, the demographic projections, this is one part of data where we can't say we don't know. It's out there. We know, and these projections are based, it's very simple, essentially. The population growth or decline in a given country is a factor of fertility and mortality rates. And neither of those you can change overnight, even if you decide. So even if you want to tamper with these data, it takes a lot of time. So we know over the next decade, couple of decades, what will be the size of populations. We also know that economic prosperity, particularly in very developed economies that have a strong social welfare system and a very sophisticated fiscal system, economic prosperity is very linked to the size of the working age population. The only thing that can change the projected decline in the populations of the West, and therefore of their economies, is an influx of migration. It's the only factor that can change the net outcome of the relationship between fertility and mortality. This is not an easy discourse to have in public opinion. It doesn't come, it's not a cry from the heart. It doesn't call on established prejudices about foreigners, but it's the reality. And the sooner it catches up and the better this discourse takes place in public opinion, the more we'll have a lot of concrete deliverables to make that happen in a way that everybody wins. The countries of origin, destination, the migrants, worker, and all the people that are related to them, including the host communities.
Thank you.
Paula Dupré-Lebias, CNN Money, Switzerland. I just wanted to know how you can assure that your fact-finding process right now is balanced, and I'd like to understand a little bit more how these, this data is collected, and that you assure that it is real, and that there's not too much influence or too much pressure coming from certain actors, if you wish, state or other.
And then I go through.
I think it self-regulates it. As I said before, our intention, declared intention from the start was to make this an inclusive and transparent process, so open it up to everybody who has something to bring to the table. And then once we go into the negotiation phase, I think it will show itself what are the credible contributions, the credible information that are brought into the discussion. And then also, of course, we will have to find out, or member states have to find out which part they can agree on. But I think by being as open and as transparent, as inclusive as possible, I think we avoid the risk to a large extent that it's being influenced by a certain narrative, and especially a narrative that doesn't really reflect the reality. This said, another conclusion or another discovery for me over these last months was that I expected there was much more data on, because it's such an issue. Everybody talks about it. I thought there was much more clarity about the actual figures, and that's, if I can venture, that's probably one of the outcomes, that we will ask for more data, more research on what really is going on, how many people move, for what reasons, from where to where. That's one of the discoveries for me.
Though, I'm sorry, thank you. The potential weaknesses of data is the way to contain or correct perceptions or misperceptions, and to build a more objective picture of the migration phenomenon. That's fair. That's first. So data is truly the way forward. Data, statistics, figures, etc. Second is what Ambassador Lauber said, which is, it is true that there is limited data available on migration, because the migration phenomenon is extremely complex. It's very big. It has too many angles, faces, and there's only very little data available. Now, that data that is available comes from very serious sources, like the World Bank, the same United Nations, IOM, OECD, and some governments. So that one is credible. The problem is not so much that, but overall the lack of more data available. One big challenge of this is that the origin of the data, always many data on almost whatever, of course, are the countries themselves. So you depend on the original source of data collection, and that very much goes to countries and regions' capacity, institutional capacity to collect this data. And on that, let's say, the floor is very uneven. And finally, on one of the major absence of data, and that we need to work on it, is on irregular migration, which is a fundamental piece of information that we are missing and we need, and it's going to be complex to get. We understand, we know more or less, or that there are more or less 240, 250 million migrants. Even that figure more or less varies, but it's fair. But we don't know how many of them are regular or irregular. And it's critical to understand how many of them are irregular. That we don't know. There are some projections, some extrapolations, some attempts to get a figure, but we don't have hard data because irregular migration is very difficult to monitor, adding to the capacity or less capacity to obtain it. So that's a good example of the challenge. So the challenge is not the credibility, so much the credibility or the good faith of the data, is in the complexity of acquiring the data, but we need that data. The process itself is encouraging and boosting data process, so increasingly we are getting more data, but as Ambassador Lauber said, one of the outcomes of the process itself clearly has to be the pursuit of hard data, more information on the subject for the future.
Let me just add, maybe very quickly on this issue. On some issues, numbers matter. For instance, on population growth. And on that, the population division of the UN has some capacity to do that. On a lot of other issues, I'm not sure I would call that data. I think it's more evidence we need, sociological evidence. Yeah. It doesn't always have to be entirely accurate, but this process that we've been engaged in, I think, has brought to the floor, particularly through the contribution of experts who are leading the panels on all these consultations, have brought, I think, to the floor, at the very least, questions that force us to confront our stereotypical views of issues. I'll give you one example. On one panel on smuggling, one expert said, again, smuggling being an illegal activity, it's like irregular migration. It's difficult to measure. UNODC has some data on that, but we don't know everything we need to know about it. But we all have stereotypical images of smugglers. Well, this expert who testified said that she and her colleagues had looked in the United States at every single conviction for smuggling in the last, whatever it was, 10 years. And the profile that emerged was that 96% of these convictions for smugglers involved a person who didn't have a weapon, didn't have a criminal record, and had no known affiliation to an international network of smugglers. These were people who lived in border states and assisted people in entering the country irregularly, or sometimes can devise scheme, that's another thing about irregular migration, to assist people in entering legally, and then, of course, overstaying the terms of their visas and then becoming an irregular situation. So you don't need numbers sometimes. You just need an open mind to understand that most issues are on a spectrum of severity. This is not to undermine the necessity to deal with the horrendous smugglers who are actually murderers in some cases, who dispose of human life when their own interest is at stake as though it didn't matter. But we must also remember that historically, a lot of the people that today we would call smugglers were heroes, people who assisted refugees reaching safety. If we could bring to this conversation this air of reality, that everything's a little more complicated than the stereotypical approach, we're going to make progress.
Thank you.
Oui, Michel Letet, de l'Ordre de Malte. Merci, Madame, merci, Messieurs les ambassadeurs, d'être là, de vos exposés et de votre disponibilité, je dirais. Alors, permettez-moi de poser juste une question. Donc, l'année prochaine, on va notamment célébrer le 70e anniversaire de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme. Il est clair que certains réfugiés, certains migrants sont privés de pratiquement tous les droits de l'homme, pratiquement des plus essentiels, et que eux ne sont pas simplement victimes de passeurs, mais sont victimes de trafiquants. Alors, Madame, bien sûr, vous avez vu ça aussi sur le plan pénal, si j'ose dire. La Suisse célèbre la semaine prochaine une journée européenne de la lutte contre le trafic des êtres humains, mais j'aimerais savoir quelle sera la contribution de ces deux pactes mondiaux, de ces deux Global Compacts pour la lutte contre ce fléau de l'esclavage moderne.
Well, just... vous avez parlé français? Oui. Well, this is another area in which actually there are instruments that are already in place. There are international conventions to combat human trafficking. So in this area, the Global Compact, I think, is an opportunity to re-energize and maybe to develop new means of state cooperation to deal with these issues. We have to keep in mind, however, that smuggling is first of all, is an offense against the state, not necessarily an offense against the person. Trafficking is an offense against the person, and it is not necessarily cross-border. So it's not exclusively a migration issue. A lot of it occurs nationally. So, but this is an environment where we can't make a lot of progress in developing a binding international instruments. They're already there. So it's more a question of developing the better methods of, in particular, identification of trafficked victims in cross-border movements, particularly amongst large flows of mixed migrants, where certainly according to a lot of the NGOs who work on the ground, they are many, many people who may not have been trafficked at the origin of their sometimes very long journey. It takes people years in different transits to land somewhere, and many of them become victims of trafficking along the process, and there have to be better methods of identifying their symptoms. As you know, trafficked victims, for the most part, do not denounce their abusers for fear not only of the retaliation against themselves or their families from the criminals, but for fear of deportation. So there are different ways in which we could do better, but the framework is in place.
Okay. Petite question.
Juste une dernière question. Je ne me suis pas présenté, je suis journaliste sénégalais, je suis le correspondant du Soleil, qui est le quotidien national, et directeur de Contenant Premier. Une dernière question, mais adressée au modérateur. Oh. Oui, parce qu'effectivement, il y a quelque chose d'assez transversal. Ils ont beaucoup parlé de préjugés, de stéréotypes. Vous êtes journaliste. Monsieur Guimétan, quel peut être le rôle de la presse dans le cadre du remodelage ou du remaking de l'image du migrant? Parce que ça aide peut-être. Je vous remercie.
Je me sens interpellé.
Vous l'êtes.
Bon, mais ce n'est pas l'objet de la conférence de presse aujourd'hui. Mais non, ce que je peux dire, c'est vrai que c'est un vrai problème, parce qu'on voit que la presse elle a tendance à déformer les sujets d'abord, elle a tendance à prendre parti, elle a tendance aussi à construire une image de l'autre ou du méchant. Moi, je suis fasciné toujours par la construction du méchant. Comment on construit le méchant coréen du Nord, le méchant iranien, le méchant russe, le méchant saoudien, enfin peu importe. Mais disons, et le méchant migrant, hein, voilà, puisqu'on est dans le sujet. Et ça, c'est un problème vrai de la presse, quoi, du journalisme. Moi, j'ai pas de solution, parce que la solution, elle repose chez ceux qui écrivent les articles, celles et ceux d'ailleurs, qui écrivent les articles, ça repose sur les éditeurs, ça repose, sur la manière dont on pratique notre métier. Mais c'est vrai que je trouve que depuis une quinzaine d'années, le niveau global s'est plutôt péjoré, c'est plutôt aggravé, et la presse a tendance, en tout cas une certaine presse, même la presse mainstream qui défend les droits de l'homme, a tendance à choisir le camp, les bons camps et le mauvais camp, etc. C'est un problème. Même chose pour l'islam, par exemple. C'est pas seulement les migrants, il y a toute une catégorie. Ça tourne, hein, c'est pas toujours les mêmes d'ailleurs. Ça, c'est peut-être le seul point positif. Mais voilà. Bien, ben écoutez, si vous permettez, si vous pas de conclusion, c'est tout bon.
C'est bon.
Si nos intervenants si, mais
Can I just say something on the press?
Si, con mucho gusto.
No, quickly, this migration affects everybody around the world. It's not only the migrant. It's not only even the families or the relatives of the migrants themselves. Are normally communities at large, either because they lose members of the community or because of the enormous contribution that migrants make economically, or because migrants arrive to other communities. So societies need to be aware, need to be informed, need to understand, and need to be part of this process. It sounds grandiose, but it's not. It's very important, and I think the press there has an enormous role to play. Thank you.
Voilà, justement, Benjamin Moser du Compact Magazine. Mais justement, je suis bien d'accord, on parle de la migration, etc., mais vous ne parlez pas que justement de la guerre. Il y a tellement de guerres au monde, et ce sont surtout ces guerres qui créent majoritairement ces migrants. Et puis moi, je suis un peu perplexe que vous ne parlez pas de la cause.
Très brièvement, la première réponse, c'est qu'il y a en marche présentement deux pactes. Two compacts are being launched, a global compact on migration and a global compact on refugees. These are two different processes. The global compact on refugee has the benefit, of course, of the existing refugee convention and is a process that is led by UNHCR. And so this is a separate process. I don't want to suggest that wars and conflict and internal conflict produce only refugees, but there's no question that it does produce a lot of cross-border displacement that is recognized by the Refugee Convention, not only in the definition of persecution, but more broadly. So a lot of that is addressed in the other compact. But this compact on migration generally will also look, or at least is grounded in what are called the drivers of migration, the push factors and the pull factors. And amongst the so-called push factors, there's a whole range of issues. Conflict is clearly one of them, but so is severe economic deprivation, lack of development, corruption, famine, climate change. There's a lot of other factors. But there's no doubt that the prevention of conflict would have an impact on reducing forced displacement. It's not the only factor, but it's a very important one, but it produces mostly refugees.
And the discussion is very much taking place also. We had among these 6 thematic consultations we had, one was devoted to the issue of the drivers of migration, one that took place in Geneva, and that very much is part of the discussion. And it's just because I'm after the microphone again, I thank you very much for your availability and for your interest, because that's really the first step then to have a better reporting on the migration issues. And if at any point later through the process any of us can be of use to you, please don't hesitate, either through Guy or directly through our missions here. We are more than willing to tell you where the process is, how the process is going, so you can have an opportunity to communicate this to the wider public. But thank you very much for this opportunity.
Okay, thank you. Thank you to everybody. So we can take a date for the next meeting next year to make what you could achieve and not achieve. Okay.
If we were right or wrong in our optimism.
Thanks.